I'd like to just sort of first start out by welcoming everyone to the first day of the Western sessions for the Bridging Transport Research Conference. This is our fifth year of being fully online, fully free, open for anyone to attend. And so, excuse me. So yeah, we've had one day of sessions in the East, and unfortunately I wasn't able to attend, but from what I hear, those went very well. And now we're very happy to have Professor Kai Axhausen from ETH Zurich start us out today. And he's going to be talking about, could an e-bike city work, but also walking, transit, and scooters. So without any further ado, I'll hand it off to Kai to start his presentation. Well, maybe just one quick note. If you have questions, you can post them in the chat box, and then at the end of Kai's presentation, I'll sort of facilitate and curate those questions. Okay, I'll hand it off to you, Kai.
Good. I hope that the slides are visible.
Yep. Yep.
Good. Excellent. Thanks for inviting me to start this off. I had a look at the program, and I'm a bit of an outlier, I guess, in what I'm going to talk about. But I think that is normal, given that academics don't like to do this type of work because it doesn't get funded, it gets you into trouble because it's hard to publish. But I think it's still necessary. And I'll explain why it's necessary as I go along. So the question which we, as a team at ETH, are asking us, could a city which is designed and thought of from the perspective of micromobility and e-bikes in particular work? Could such a city deliver the accessibilities which we are needing to make our cities and our societies work, in particular in urban areas? We haven't really thought about suburbia yet, never mind what is left of the countryside, but let's start with the city. And I'll tell you why we got there and what we think about it. Now, before we think about anything, we have to put us into a mindset which allows for change. And I think we very often kind of imprison ourselves with words, oh, that doesn't work. People will never do it. Oh, this is too big a change. Oh, you can't get that accepted. So I think we should accept that travel behavior has changed over time. And sometimes it changes very drastically and very rapidly. And just to remind ourselves of that, let's look at the share of mobile people between September 19 and December 2022, i.e. before the pandemic and after the pandemic started. You can see the blue lines are the numbers of the share of mobile people, are people who are leaving the house to do an activity out of home before the pandemic. And you can see that that share was kind of 95%, 92%. And then you can see with the red line and the yellow line that the share dropped and continued to stay low. And yes, we had this massive impact of the lockdown, the kind of lockdown Switzerland had. These are Swiss numbers. In the beginning of 2020, but afterwards, the Swiss kind of ignored the various waves of the pandemic and stayed at home, a lot more so than before. So it's a change which you wouldn't have thought possible with the matching change in working practices happened overnight. And I do believe that this tells us that change is possible, incremental or sudden, if there's a reason to come to that change. So keep that in mind when I continue to talk. Okay. Now, I think that transport policy has a major dilemma, i.e., it is in a wicked problem for which it currently doesn't know a solution. And I do believe that we have to offer solutions so that society can move forward, because just continuing business as usual, more of the same, gets us even more into the dead end. Okay. What is the key reason behind this? Transport, demand, and consumption is a normal good, i.e., we respond by consuming more of it when the costs are lowered. And we have to remember that society, and we as engineers helping it, have done nothing but lowering the normal consumption cost of transport, the generalized cost of transport, for the last 250 years. And we have all intentions to continue to do so, but that might be a dilemma because the impacts of it are hitting a buffer, and that's why we are stuck. Just to remind us why we have done this and why we were happy actually with that continuous growth of consumption of travel is the link between GDP, i.e., the resources to make us richer, and the travel we needed. So if you look at the blue keywords, it's GDP, which is really at the core of what Western societies and now societies worldwide are trying to increase, can be increased by raising the economies of scale of our production, and the reverse by becoming more specialized, i.e., producing more valuable goods or services. Now, when we do that, we have to increase the market size. If you become the world expert in a tiny, tiny, tiny area, or a firm which becomes the specialist in a tiny, tiny product, you have to have your country or the world as your market. When you do that, when you have that, you have all incentive to have lower generalized costs of travel, which is this red K. Because you don't want to waste your gains you have from the economies of scale and the specialization on transport. We couldn't be the specialists we are in our academic fields without the low cost of airline and railway travel, because we would be stuck somewhere in the middle of nowhere, essentially, given on a worldwide scale, and we couldn't communicate. And the same holds true for everybody. Now, these generalized costs of travel are lowered and have been lowered by increasing the fleet comfort, i.e. having nicer vehicles, nicer planes, nicer trains, faster trains, safer trains, and by building more slots, i.e. building more capacity on the ground or in the air to allow us to travel. Now, I won't go through all the details here, but I think I just want to remind you, this was our objective, and still is to some extent, but we are hitting a buffer. Now, to show you how this actually played out, this is a time-scaled map of Switzerland of 1950. So we took the original geographic map and rescaled it so that the distances can now be read in travel time, and the scale is given at the bottom. Now, this is 1950, and between 1950 and 2000, the Swiss built their motorway system, and they shrunk the country by a factor of 2. The scale is the same. And it's obviously no surprise that when you do that on the roadside, on the railway side, it wasn't quite as drastic, but they also achieved massive shrinking. We travel more. And this, I think, is important to realize that we consume more. This is between 1995 and 2015. The increase in person kilometers traveled, as documented by the Swiss National Travel Diary Survey, which is a very well-run CATI, computer telephone-aided telephone survey. Now, 2021, which is the drop, is due to COVID and the changes in behavior we had, which is completely outside of the general trend we had so far. So this just reminds us of the fact transfer planning wants to make the world more accessible by lowering the generalized cost of travel. And as expected, people consume more of the travel, which we want them to consume, to be more productive economically and increase the social capital and maintain the social capital which they have. So just coming back to the dilemma. So what is the dilemma now? The dilemma is we want to increase accessibility to improve productivity and social capital. But doing that, we do that by providing more capacity. But unfortunately, we design the capacity for peak load because we don't like congestion, either as designers or as users of those facilities, of those roads. Now, this peak capacity, which is also unpriced, is underused off-peak by definition. And that obviously encourages overuse in those periods. Now, in the past, we didn't care because all of those miles traveled wasn't perceived as a problem. But now, with our awareness of global warming, any additional travel becomes an issue. So increasing capacity further increases our CO2 or greenhouse gas emission output, and we don't want that anymore, or we can't accept that anymore. Then we are actually continuing to do so because with the shift to electric vehicles, we are increasing demand even further because electric vehicles will be, if they become mass-produced, they will become cheaper to buy and cheaper to operate than current vehicles. So we induce demand even further. And yes, they will reduce CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, but maybe not enough. And then to make things worse is the competition for public transport becomes even harder against the electric vehicles when we are starting to work from home, because working from home undermines the case to commit yourself to public transport through a season ticket. If you're not going 250 times a year to your workplace, but maybe only 150 times or 120 times, it doesn't pay anymore to buy a season ticket. And without the season ticket, you're obviously much less likely to use public transport. You're much less likely to use public transport for a non-work trip as you currently do. So we are removing the most important and most sustainable mode of transport, making it less attractive. Now, we have this issue because we are now realizing that CO2, or better actually greenhouse gases, have to be reduced if we want to avoid a massive further increase in the average temperatures on Earth. And I guess this year, with its very strange weather and its massive peak in June, July, gives us a warning of what is likely to happen if we continue along this route. In addition, that's maybe different between countries, but certainly in Switzerland, we don't want to increase sprawl any further than we already have. So any further lowering of the generalized cost of travel invites sprawl, and we actually don't really want this. And then, because building roads is actually expensive and slow, any further VMT growth or person kilometer traveled growth increases congestion beyond what we already have. So as planners, we have to rethink, how can we get out of this just adding more capacity mode in which we still are? What other visions can we offer to the public and the decision makers as an alternative to what they know and have learned to accept? Now, as an aside, inside the cities, we are pretty constrained. In work, sorry, I didn't give the source, 2 PhD students of the Institute here in Zurich looked at the macroscopic diagrams, fundamental diagrams of 120 city areas around the world, and they were able to show that the capacity which is available at urban networks is pretty fixed. You can do quite a bit with traffic control, but other than that, if you know the junction density, if you know the lane miles, if you know the pinch points in the network, and if you know how much public transport there's offered on this network, you can predict the capacity and you can't change it much. So, as urban planners, we can't really hope to get out of this by getting more capacity out of the urban networks, certainly for the congestion problem, which we have had and continue to have, unless we are willing and thinking about massive underground networks like those which Musk is envisioning with his supposedly cheap tunneling machines. Okay, so where are we? We are at a point where we don't really know the way forward. So maybe it's worth looking backwards. Because the last 100 years, 120 years, we have worked to match a couple of visions which were put forward in the 1920s as the way forward for the cities then. Now, remind yourself that in the 1920s, the planners and engineers and designers and architects hated the 19th century city because it was dense, crowded, sometimes still unsanitary, and smoky and awful. They wanted to break out of that situation. So the visions which they put forward at a time when sprawl wasn't really considered a problem yet was to build outwards and upwards. One of the most famous of these visions was Le Corbusier's Cité Radieuse, his idea of how to redesign urban areas. He also had a vision for Paris, which essentially built with the same building blocks you see on the slide here, i.e. towers in the park, very wide urban streets, not urban streets anymore, motorways already. And in this particular vision, he also envisaged a little airfield right between the tower blocks. And I would argue that about 1/2 of what was built after the war was trying to match that idea. Obviously, scaled down and much cheaper and not as grandiose as Le Corbusier could do on his sketch block. But these are the cities which were built to a large extent. If you are traveling through China or Singapore or certain places in Europe, you see these type of cities. The other vision was Frank Lloyd Wright's Usonia. Frank Lloyd Wright, an American architect from Wisconsin, was a modernist, but he had nothing but disdain for the city. And he suggested that you could solve all the urban problems, not only the density, but also the supposed moral degeneration of those cities, by putting everybody on an acre of land, give the person, or in this case still a man, and his wife and the children, an acre of land, a house and a car, and then connect them by roads. And that was kind of the other half of how we built our cities after the war. Maybe not as nicely designed as Frank Lloyd Wright would have done it, but this is what we did. And we did it with vengeance, and it's very hard for us to think of anything else now, certainly in the rich parts of the world. Another vision, which didn't really come to fruition, but is still at the back of people's mind, was Colin Buchanan's two-level central London, i.e. solving the urban traffic problem by making more space for the car and moving the pedestrians out of the way. This was his idea of how Tottenham Court Road in London should look like. Hopefully and gratefully, the British didn't build it. But this idea that we can avoid urban transport problems by just building more capacity is still with us. And people are still thinking along those lines. Another vision, and that one again was actually realized, is kind of the European version of Usonia. In this case, taking the Radford idea of the street network, here a tree-like network in suburbia connecting to one major access egress point to a motorway or motorway-like road. This we built with a vengeance, and certainly in Europe, and I guess in the US as well. And the last of those visions, which we are still dreaming of and realizing, obviously the motorways. This is an image from the 1920s, 30s. And this idea that we can build roads which will be sunlit, empty, and smooth is still in everybody's head. It's not this idea of what the reality looks like, i.e. the roads are potholed, it's not sunny, and it's crowded. This is not really in the back of the minds of the voters and the engineers. They still imagine that the world could look like that, and everybody would be happy. And now in the future with electric vehicles driving on them. Now, we as planners know that's not ever going to look like that, but for 4 o'clock on a Sunday, 4 a.m. in the Sunday, but never mind. Now, if we now see these past visions and we accept that they're still in our heads and are still driving decisions, we have to ask what is currently being discussed. Are any of those visions which we are currently, solutions we are currently discussing, have the same emotional power? And do they have actually a chance of realizing and solving the problems we are looking at? And remind you that we have two problems. We have the congestion problem and we have the CO2 problem. These are related, but essentially independent of each other. Now, one vision, which is appealing to all the engineers and economists among us, is to say, oh, let's manage and coordinate everything. We can solve the problem that way. Now, the issue is that they might not work, because when you look at the management of demand, you're immediately talking about pricing or equivalent rationing. And here I list kind of the prices you would need to manage urban transport. You would want to have a two-part tariff to pay for the infrastructure as such. So an option fee, which pays for the fact that you might want to use it, and you then want to have a pay-as-you-go fee for your usage, kilometer-based fee, and also then differentiated by the weight of the vehicle which you're driving. Then you would want to have a congestion pricing on top to make sure that the speed which is experienced by the drivers is reasonable. Then you would have demand responsive pricing for parking along Donald Shoup's ideas. Then the next level is you would want to price for greenhouse gas emissions to make sure that we reach the greenhouse gases And then you would add pricing for noise and any other thing, which is a local nuisance, which needs to be controlled. Now, we know that this would work. I think the examples around the world show us that we can do that. But we also know that in most countries, in most cities, it's a political dead-end street. I would guess no politician would be willing to campaign on the basis that she would introduce this level of pricing. I'm pretty sure that the currently 660% of the car-owning voters would be against it. And so I'm not sure whether this pricing is really getting us anywhere. Now, the other idea, which is currently being put forward, is saying, okay, we can make public transport dramatically better. Mobility as a service will allow the travelers to smoothly integrated travel from A to B without any worries. Now, I'm all in favor of mobility as a service or of better public transport services, but we have a high hurdle to jump, because when you look at the impacts this might have, you have to ask yourself, how much more expensive in generalized cost terms is public transport today vis-a-vis private transport? What we have here is I use data, it's MOBIS, it's a large-scale GPS tracking study. We calculated mode choice models. The mode choice models gave us the estimates of the generalized costs, and we then compared the trips taken against the alternative. And when you then compare that, you can see that without a season ticket, i.e. the fat lines, public transport is twice as expensive as private transport in generalized cost terms. So public transport has an enormously high hurdle to jump to get many people to shift to public transport. Okay, you could say, let's give everybody a season ticket so that they forget about the variable cost of travel. But even then, the ratio is only about 1-to-1. And that, as we all know, would indicate a market share of only 50%. So public transport is an extremely hard sell to make this the solution for everybody. Good. So maybe pricing and mobility as a service will not allow us to solve all the problems. Now, the other hope is automation. I guess you're much closer to the action. You follow every problem Waymo has, or every triumph Waymo has now in Phoenix and San Francisco and elsewhere, Boston to come. And we all have read the claims that automated vehicles will generate lots and lots of extra capacity, so we get out of the way. And if you make them electric, they might also solve the CO2 greenhouse gas problem at the same time. Now, one of the problems I have with this is, if you look at the cost of those vehicles, they probably will not be used in a shared mode, which would be really good, but they probably won't be used in a shared mode, because this is based on a paper by 3 PhD students of mine, with whom we estimated the cost of automated vehicles. The first thing to note is they are going to be a third cheaper than current motorized vehicles, which indicates a large induced demand effect. And when you have a commercially operating automated taxi or pooled service, that will be massively more expensive than the variable cost of a private automated vehicle. So, as I don't believe that people will shift their attitudes to the costs of a private car, they will not use a taxi, or not nearly as much as they would need to do to have a big impact. And this massive reduction in the cost would indicate large amounts of induced demand. And with automated vehicles, you have the chance of driving the car without sitting in it. So this vehicle becomes a tool in your daily life, but it's cruising on the roads. And that's an obvious problem for us on the demand side. Now, so yes, automated vehicles will come, and they might be a good idea on the safety front, but there is the issue that they will increase congestion massively. Now, the big hope is electric vehicles will solve the problem, or at least the other problem, i.e. the greenhouse gas problem. I'm not sure about that. One of my students put together some numbers and came out with some estimates, and it's in line with others which have done similar attempts. And it's not looking as if electric vehicles will allow us to reach the greenhouse gas targets which we have. So yes, the today's electric vehicles would lower the emissions from the black to the first green bar, and yes, more electric vehicles and better electric vehicles would lower it even further. But then you have to think about population growth. You have to look at the induced demand effect, which electric cars bring because of their lower costs. If you then add the demand effect of autonomous driving, you are unfortunately well above the IPCC sector targets. Now, the question which we have is, what do we do then if electric vehicles is not enough? If automation is not enough? If I was talking about that the current visions which we are pursuing might not get us where we need to go. So what else can we do? These are not the only ones which we're talking about. I think one is, which is pursued in many urban areas, some more explicit, some less explicit, is the idea, let's get rid of the car, let's reduce its use. And the prominent ones are the 15-minute city, which has been put forward in Paris. There's people who argue for a net zero city. There are many cities which are encouraging and making cycling more friendly, but they're still doing it incrementally. And this is the reason why the team here in Zurich thinks about a radical change and says, okay, let's start to think the city around the e-bike. Because the e-bike is a real game changer, because it reaches speeds which are comparable to urban speeds of urban traffic. It is relatively cheap in contrast to a car, so could be affordable to many more people, and would have actually some health benefits on top of it all. So what are we looking at now? The e-bike city then says, okay, if we are really want to change things, we really have to change things. And one way of doing that is to say, take 50% of the existing road space and hand it over to the slow vehicles, the e-bikes, the bikes, whatever else you have. We want to maintain the current accessibility levels for everyone. And we obviously have to integrate the shared services, because we still will need buses, we still need wheel trams, we still need undergrounds for moving large amounts of people at the same time. That doesn't change. So along those three premises, we are currently looking at how this would look like. So take a current cross-section, and the idea is, let's move 50% of that to the e-bike or the bike. So a city street, here an example from Zurich, would be transformed in this way. So As you can see, there's still a bit of parking. There's lots of bicycle parking. There's only one lane for car traffic and a bidirectional lane for the bikes. This is a first sketch, and we are now currently looking at all the design specifications, how such a city could be designed, so that we have tools to do that, as well as to build them. And that's really what the project is about. And then also to look at the impact that will have on travel behavior and costs and greenhouse gas emissions and all the follow-on issues which we have to address. Now, when we do that, we then have to think about the winners and losers, because in political terms, it's the losers who are shouting loudest. The winners are normally fine, they just accept their wins, but they don't really go for it very hard. And in the Swiss context, where we need to win a referendum, i.e. Win 50.1% of the votes, it's particularly important that we have a prior knowledge of possible losers and winners. And I think I've listed those which I believe will be winners and losers. And you can see on the losing list at the bottom of the slide are the urban car users. And given that, even in a city like Zurich, 40%, 35% of the households and persons have a car, they will be loudly making their point of view known. And it's even clearly even worse or even harder if we go to suburbia, where the majority of the residents have their own car. And what we will have to discuss in this fight, in this election, is to what extent are the disbenefits for the current users outweighs by the gains, in particular of the future generations. Because global warming is here, global warming will become even worse. So we'll have to think about how we can balance the needs of today against the needs of the future. And for that, we believe that an e-bike city would become a possibility to talk about this, because we would be able to offer an equivalent level of service to today's, but without the car at the center of the urban traffic. There's obviously lots of further questions, lots of technical questions, academic questions, which we are currently looking at. How to look at optimal one-way street networks, which we would get if we do this. We have to look at the costs. We have to look at the current behavior of e-bikes, and we have to think about how our daily behavior would change. We have to look at future mode choice and demand. We have to look at the CO2 impacts, and on and on. And there are issues which we haven't really looked at in this project, as freight and service delivery, road safety, and other things. So this project is at the very start of its work, not quite very start, we are a year into the project, but we have 2 more years to go, and we hope to get an extension. So there's many further questions, and we would very welcome other groups and other people to work with us to see if such a vision is actually reasonable and useful for further discussion. I have to thank and acknowledge the contributions of everybody currently involved, the PIs and the researchers working on the project, and in particular, Mrs. Livingston, who has been the coordinator so far of the project. And then I can be happy to take questions. These are the websites where you can find more information about what we are doing. There's a project website, and then there is a large-scale survey currently being undertaken of e-bike users. So if you do need data on e-bike users, talk with us and we might be able to help you. So I'm looking forward to questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Kai. I think we did have a few questions in the chat box that we lost that fortunately, if my memory serves me well enough, I can maybe
yes,
ask those. so we had a question from Lewis Merlin, and I believe you kind of addressed this a little bit towards the end, but he had a question sort of about, aren't a lot of these kind of issues around private vehicle ownership and, and the impacts of transportation, really a question of equity and the ability of low-income households to really control the modes that are available to them. Is it really a question of, high-income households really having a disproportionate role in transport planning and policy?
Now, I think there's a couple of issues which are raised. One is the question, to what extent it's only rich people who have cars. Now, then the second question is, what do you do when you live in suburbia or exurbia? And then there's the question, is it in particular the poor households living in exurbia or suburbia who will be affected by this? And this is a clearly worry which we have and which we want to look at. But you have to then ask yourself is, to what extent can the reformulated urban transport system of the e-bike city, which has the e-bike and has obviously public transport in place, replace the car equivalently? Now, obviously, a lot of this and assumptions we are making is driven by our experience in Switzerland and Europe in particular, where generally public transport is good. People can cycle and will cycle. And we are not talking about America, where kind of being nasty, you would summarize it as a place with cars and people who can't cycle.
Yeah, so I think Kara had a couple of questions. One of them was on the MOBIS survey. Potentially, some of those people who are being identified as mobile, just making, it's their device moving maybe, once a day, and they're being defined as mobile.
I think, yes, this is a very crude definition. These are people who leave the house at least once. But this has been the same throughout the survey period. And when we look at the amount of number of trips and activities people undertake, that actually didn't change. For those people who left their house, there was no reduction in the total level of activity. Certainly in the Swiss data.
Mm-hmm. So I think Lewis had another question. When you say the same level of accessibility for the e-bike city, how would you measure this? So he says, clearly some people's accessibility would increase, others would obviously decrease with this. So.
Okay, yes, I think accessibility, there unfortunately are dozens of ways of doing that. Our preferred way is to use a Hansen style measure, or alternatively spoken, the log sum term of a destination choice model.